One and all, and welcome to this week's edition of Weekly Chat with myself and, of course, the resident genius, that is Ralph Hopkin. Hello there. Brilliant. Now, I thought that this week was quite quiet in terms of company results and releases and stuff like that. And I thought, actually, as we have we are now past the longest day of the year, sadly. I also thought that it might be a good idea to have a check-in with the themes that I mentioned at the beginning of the year, or in Watson's Yearly. Now, in Watson's Yearly, towards the end of the report, I mentioned 6 themes, and what we're going to do is we're going to go through each one and basically see where we are currently. So for the first one, we will talk about so I posed the question: is the world veering towards populism? Now, we've seen there have been a lot of elections so far this year. The European elections have been very recently, and they caused all sorts of they had all sorts of repercussions, shall we say, that we will be talking about in a minute. But yes, it does seem that the pendulum does seem to be swinging from the left to the right. But what do you think about that, Ralph?
Yes, it certainly does. And we talked about this a little bit at the start of the year, where we basically said, this is the year for democracy, which is a bit of a sort of almost like a clickbait title, because even those countries have elections where you don't really have a democracy, like in Russia, for example. So it is certainly the year of elections. And we are now at the half-year stage, and what better time to check back in with the theme, take a look at what elections we've had, and possibly even more importantly, what elections we are still going to have, and what might transpire there in light of what we can now see. Well, I think in terms of populism, is populism on the rise? I think we all kind of sense that the answer to that is yes. And if it is, then one wonders, why is it on the rise? And my answer to that is geopolitical pressures and some other points. But maybe we should first take a look at one recent election and just see what the evidence there was in light of this particular question. And I am, of course, talking about the European elections. Now, this is interesting because normally I wouldn't talk about the European elections. Indeed, nobody would. Because not even those... No, indeed, it's like European Song Contest. Actually, I think more people talk about that.
More people than about that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, not even populations or countries who are in the European Union talk a lot about the European elections. And I've been, of course, German, I still am, for a very long time. I lived in Germany, and I know that as a citizen of a core European country, nobody ever really much talked about European elections. And the reason for that is that although the European Union does pass regulations which are then enshrined into national law and therefore are relevant to the citizens of these various countries in some way, it is not felt as if that particular impact is immediate and indeed outweighs the more immediate impact of your local government. Local meaning your national government. And one statistic which I would like to start with and bring to your attention is therefore just a turnout in these elections. And I have a statistic here in front of me, which is quite telling, in particular because it's now too small and I can't actually read it, so apologize. Here we go. In 1979, the turnout was 62%. Since then, it has come down year after year after year, until in 2014, it reached its nadir, I think is the word, the trough, where it was 43%. So we went from 62% to 43%. that's less than half. So less than half of people were interested in going to these elections or voting in them. Then in 2019, the election in 2014 was followed by the election in 2019. So in the next election, turnout jumped from 43% to 51%. And in 2024, the election has been, it has again been 51%. The reason that this is interesting at all is because traditionally, in sort of recent memory, European elections were used by the electorate as a protest vote because it wasn't directly relevant. If I wanted to vote for the monster raving bin party, which is now merged in the UK, but anyway, that's a different thing. Then I could do so in the European elections because nothing was riding on it. I wouldn't get a prime minister in my own country from that party, so there was no worry. I could therefore freely express a stark criticism of my government if I wished to do so. And that is why the European elections have traditionally been seen as a protest vote. If, therefore, the turnout in these elections goes up from 40% to 51%, then clearly that in itself is the very first indicator that people feel more critical of their governments, more frustrated with the current policy measures as implemented by their governments. And that is therefore the first indication that we have that people are beginning to be more unhappy with their governments. Now let's take a look at the actual at the actual election results. And this is a little bit complicated. I'm not going to go into the detail unless somebody asks me to, because European. Oh God, no! I still won't. The European Parliament works like any other national parliament, but of course the parties which you find there are not the parties which you find in the nation states. So what happened is that all the various parties in the nation states have sort of come together and form groups in the European Parliament. So these are the analogues, if you like, of the national of the of the parties which you see in Germany, in the UK, etc. And these groups are, I'll just read them out to you, from starting with political hue on the left towards going to the right. So the first one is called the left. No prize for guessing what that is. And then you have something called the Socialists and Democrats. If the UK was still in the EU, I don't know whether you guys noticed, but we left the EU. I don't know why. Anyway, we are no longer in the EU. If we were still in the EU, the Socialists and Democrats group would house the Labour Party. The Labour Party would be in that group. That's the sort of parties which you find there. Then you have the Green European Free Alliance. Again, no prize for guessing. That's the Green parties in the European nation states are in that group. Then you have something called Renew Europe. That's where the Lib Dems would be. The leader of that group is Macron. His party Renaissance, which is sort of moderately left of center party or right of center party in other ways, that's what you would find there. Then you have the EPP, European People's Party. These are conservatives, so our conservative party would be in there. And then you go further to the right. You have ECR, which is something else. There we have Thatcherites, basically, and Giorgia Meloni of Italian, what are they called? Brothers of Italy, is the leader of that particular group. And then we go more to the right still, Identity and Democracy. I find this funny that this particular group calls itself Identity, as in identity politics. And there we find Marine Le Pen, and we would find Reform UK. And then we have Independent and Unaffiliated. These are parties which are even too or horrible for the Identity and Democracy group to contemplate. There we would find the current right-wing party in Germany, AfD. So I hope that wasn't too tedious. Just to read this out to you, that's the party spectrum which we have. Now, in the last elections, and this is a fascinating thing for me to report, you find uniformly that the left of center bloc in that groupings has lost votes and the right of center bloc has gained votes. And it is not just the sort of middle center right or center left party which have gained votes, but it is in particular the further to the right parties which have gained votes. And that's, of course, our answer to populism. Yes, the European Parliament elections very clearly demonstrate that the populist far-right parties have gained votes. And we are probably aware of what the sort of people are I'm talking about here. Very publicly, the Rassemblement National, which is Marine Le Pen's party in France, has gained a massive share of the votes. In fact, it was 31% of the votes cast in France for the European elections went to Marine Le Pen. That's far more than Macron's party. And of course, we know the result of this. Macron has, as I say to myself privately, has done a David Cameron. His snap elections have been announced. He is hoping for the French population to bail him out. He's hoping precisely that this particular turnout in favor of the far right in France was driven by a protest rather than by a valid expression of political view. And so he's hoping that the French population is not going to vote them in. But this is a very dangerous gamble. I very much expect them to be the strongest party in French Parliament after July, June. I can't remember when the elections are now. Very soon. Now, another party which has gained massive strength is the very unpalatable right-wing AfD party in Germany. They have gained 16% of the votes and are coming in number 2 after the center-right party in Germany. So again, let's pause here. We have very far-right parties gathering the highest share of the national votes in the European Parliament election. And that is very clearly indicative that populism is absolutely on the rise. What other indications are there? There are opinion polls. We've seen our own homegrown populist party, Reform UK, jumping out of almost nowhere to within 2 percentage points of opinion polls of the Conservatives, and now they're even leading. And of course, we've seen in the US, where this was always touch and go, Trump was in the lead in the opinion polls. Very recently, Biden has just about inched ahead of Mr. Trump, and I think that is the impact of the recent court judgment against Mr. Trump. But we see basically in actual elections or opinion polls everywhere that the right wing populist parties are on the rise. And so the question, are they on the rise? Yeah, there's a resounding yes. But let me just finish this section by maybe exploring very quickly why they would be on the rise. Because I don't think the electorate in any country is necessarily extremist or extreme. People are just normal people. I mean, they have their political views, sure, but I don't believe people are racists or anti-Semitists or fierce ideologists. People are just normal people. And so when you see populist parties on the rise, it always means that people are just angry. They're angry with the policies which governments are implementing. And this gets back, I think, to geopolitical uncertainty, which is these are a few of the burning issues of our time. Geopolitical uncertainty, which will scare some because they think maybe the integrity of the nation state itself is under threat as Mr. Putin invades Ukraine, and one wonders what he might do next. But also, of course, as we see political refugees, economic refugees, climate refugees pouring into European societies and putting them under pressure where they are getting to a tipping point, certainly in the public views, and that is another support for populist parties. So I think that's what I would have to offer in response. There are more elections to come, of course. Notably in Germany, there are 2 elections, state elections coming up. There are, of course, the US elections coming up. We will have to see. I believe that if the geopolitical situation doesn't get better, if the key problem of immigration isn't going to be resolved, if the key problem of cost of living isn't going to be managed somehow, then I do not believe that the rise of populism can be stopped. And this is something which I would expect as a theme, because we're talking about themes, to establish itself for the next several years, not just now for the remainder of this year. I'm thinking in terms of a decade.
Yeah, no, that is very interesting. And this year, again, we started off the year saying, like 80% of the world's population is going to be undergoing elections. We've seen a lot so far. I think, for me, one of the ironies of our current situation and Macron's move is the fact that it almost seems like the UK is going to be this island of stability against a very tumultuous Europe. And, whereas it feels like the continental Europe is swinging to the right, the UK is kind of going the opposite way and swinging to the left. And I do wonder whether this may, because of what's going on, I wonder whether this will make negotiations between the UK and Europe a bit easier than they would have been in the past, or than they are currently, because I suppose in Brussels they're quite keen. They want to keep it all together, and I guess ideologically, the Labour Party of the UK is, or certainly seems to be, positioning itself as to being closer to Europe than, say, the Conservatives have been. And if that's the case, maybe they'll feel a bit more generous, or certainly inclined to be a bit more lenient. And if it is Labour that gets in, Europe will have an excuse to be nicer, because they'll say, well, obviously Labour are more closely aligned with us, and because I think if the Conservatives won, it would be very difficult for Europe to be have a more benign attitude towards the UK, because this is the regime that basically sort of brought in the whole referendum, and B, kind of lost the whole thing. So there's a lot of history there. Whereas a new incoming Labour government, socialist government, is arguably more aligned, and it's new, and everything else seems to be falling apart. In Europe, maybe they will want to be a bit slightly more generous than they have been in the past. I don't know, but
Well, it's certainly possible. I don't know whether I would completely follow you in identifying the UK as a island of tranquility within a right-wing storm, because yes, it is true that in the latest poll of polls we have Labour polling at 41% now. But what is also true, that 7 days ago, Labour was polling at 44%. Now, that's 3 percentage points less. Now, that doesn't actually mean anything, but let us also perhaps look at the other parties here. The Conservatives polled at 23, and they're still at 23. Reform UK polled at 11, and now they're polling at 17. So Reform UK is not just taking potential voters away from the Conservative Party. They are also taking potential voters away from Labour. And while there is precious little to really sort of doubt what these elections are going to turn out to be, it is very likely that Labour is going to clinch it. I am concerned that from single digits to 17% in the polls, our own Rassemblement National, our own AFD, because that is what Reform UK is. Let's not be naive about this, has jumped to a approval rating which is more or less the same as the Conservative Party. Because you see, it is not, if you're talking about populism, the rise of populism, you're right. At the moment, we look safer than most of the European societies.
It's only relative.
But what is going to happen in 5 years' time? What's going to happen if Labour does not deliver? What is going to happen if Labour delivers exactly what they say in the manifesto they're going to deliver, i.e. nothing? Sorry, this is sarcasm, but we discussed the manifestos last week, and I do wonder what Labour is going to stand for. Now, this is not to say that Labour is not going to do a good job. What it is going to say is are they going to be able, in 5 years, to revert what the Conservatives mucked up in 17 years' time? I do wonder. And if the population doesn't see quick improvements, they might get unhappy with an incoming or a next Labour government. And if I already see that our populist party has increased in population so much, then it is certainly conceivable that they might actually increase in popularity over the next 5 years. And Reform UK is not a friendly party. Reform UK is led by a leader who is a Putin apologist, and we should be in no doubt what that party stands for. So at the moment, yeah, I agree with you. We're looking better. But are we going to look better in 5 years' time?
Yeah.
I wonder.
True. We'll see, won't we? Anyway, right. If we're here, and hopefully we're here. Yeah. Anyway, right. Let's move on to the next. Actually, let's do 2 for 1. We're doing a 2 for 1 offer this week. So 2 themes for the price of 1. I did identify 2 themes which are kind of related. We're going to see. I said we are going to see more nearshoring, and there is going to be more deglobalisation. So both of those kind of things, fairly sort of relatively well related. Now, I think that a recent example of the whole nearshoring thing is the sanctions that have been put on Chinese car imports from China to the US. So there've already been taxes put on that. So that's largely a no-go area for Chinese those companies, and they've already kind of factored that in. But most recently, we've seen the EU decide to impose a sliding scale of quite big taxes on EV imports of Chinese EVs from China. And I think that there's just more of these examples where, say, the EU and the US want to make sure that they're cutting out China in particular in the automotive arena. They want to try and cut them out from the supply chain to make them less reliant on that, and that can involve changing where the where production is. So, for instance, TSMC, which produces, which is one of the world's biggest manufacturers of semiconductors, it is being tempted to have some production, at least in the US, by the Inflation Reduction Act and the massive pot of money that can dole out. So TSMC are one of those, but we're also seeing the spreading out of production out of China, and maybe some of it is going to be in Asia, but they're also going to be, there are various gigafactories and things that are going to be made in Europe as well. But anyway, that is going on. I feel that this is an ongoing thing. We are going to see more of that. So we've already seen some. I think we're going to see more. What do you think, Ralph?
Yeah, definitely. I think that very much chimes with our theme of populism and the rise of populism, actually. Because if you think about, excuse me, if you think about onshoring and deglobalization, essentially that means that you are highlighting the importance of your own country over that of others in terms of economic, in terms of the arena in which you operate economically. And I think possibly this particular trend is going to be driven further by two large well, what's the word? I can't think of the word, but two large aspects. That wasn't a good word, but I'm going to use it. The first one is the rise of China to a hegemonial force in Southeast Asia. And the second one is populism again. Now, the first one is really easy to understand, of course, as China is becoming more economically relevant and important to the world still, and as it is actively seeking to establish itself as the hegemonial leading force in the Southeast Asia Sea, other countries will seek to protect their economies in a sense that they are not wanting to take the political risk that would come with an overinvestment in China. And in a sense, what we have seen as an object lesson of what that will entail after Putin's invasion of Ukraine, because we all know the story there. Energy prices rocketed up, and we needed to emancipate ourselves from an over-reliance on Russian oil and gas. Especially that was true for Germany, but it was also true for all other societies in Europe. And so, to the extent we still remember this very vividly, I think it plays into a protectionist stand and a stand where European countries are trying to develop industries themselves, which otherwise they would need to be too dependent on when it comes to China, in particular China. And the other one is populism, and we can link back to what we said earlier. Populists also tend to feel, that's my interpretation, feel inferior to external forces. In Germany, the AfD, in France, Rassemblement National, in England, the Reform UK, they tend to say the same things. They tend to say we need to emancipate ourselves from America. We're under the cosh of America. America is the dominant economy, the dominant country. We need to strengthen our own identity as our own national identity. And that is, of course, you can see where this is going. And the way in which this is, of course, done is by emphasizing the attractiveness of your own country over that of others in terms of country to do business with. There's nothing wrong with that, by the way, in itself. But if it is the consequence of a feeling that other countries' importance is seen as hampering your own, then it may very easily lead to isolationism, which is obviously the dark side of deglobalization. So I can see these two drivers. That's the word I wasn't able to think
Yeah.
about earlier. These two drivers. One is increasing hegemony presence of China in the Southeast Asia Sea, and by extension, a consolidation of autocratic countries as a bloc. And second is the rise of populism, which to some extent is fed by that same driver, actually. So yes, I absolutely expect that to continue as well.
Mm. I mean, I think actually we're talking at it from one side. I mean, I think it's also happening obviously from the China side as well.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a lot of state money going into building up technology in particular, and I suppose because of the ban on high tech chips, for instance, supply to China means that they are trying to do their own in order to cut the West out, So and actually, they're also investing in other countries, and other countries are investing in them as well to try. Everyone's
Yeah.
well, not everyone. Some people are there. They're trying to keep their options open, but ultimately, China itself is trying to make sure that it has less reliance on the West, for instance. So,
Yeah.
so it's
That
not
is true.
just us versus them; it's them versus it's on both sides, isn't it? Basically.
It is. There's only one thing which I would like to say in terms of China. There is a limit to which China will be able to do this because they are the preeminent producer of consumer goods in the world. Number one, there's nobody bigger. But why can they be? Well, because somebody buys these consumer goods. And who buys the consumer goods? Africa? Latin America? The Philippines? Probably not. Well, they do, but not to the extent of the free world. The free world is the customer of China. And yes, absolutely, you are right. There is that tendency as well. There is just hopefully a natural barrier, a natural limit to the extent to which this can be done. And so from the point of view of China, yes, absolutely. They will probably seek to bring onshore or keep onshore the product factors, the manufacturing capacity and capability, and perhaps insulate themselves a little bit more from the West. That might be. But I believe they do need the West and the free world as the market for the consumer goods that they ultimately seek to manufacture in their economy.
Yep, absolutely. Right, so let's move on to the next one then. So the next topic that we can bring up here, the next theme, is that I mentioned in Watson's Yearly. The push for renewable and nuclear energy will continue, and again we have seen more of that. We have seen developments in nuclear fusion. We have seen more developments in terms of especially say wind power, solar power, all sorts of things in the year so far. And I think that the overarching, I suppose the general thing has been that renewables still I think that we've come to the conclusion over the last few years that we are not yet in a position to cut out fossil fuels, to cut out nuclear, and that although there has been a lot of effort made in the fields of renewables, it's still not enough. And what is even more importantly, it's still not reliable enough. I mean, this is what I was saying to Ralph, just before this call, how I remember being very surprised a few years ago when I saw the resurgence of nuclear power, nuclear power generation, because I suppose over the year, well, especially since, let's face it, Fukushima in 2011, everyone then started saying, oh, right, renewables. I mean, even Germany, which had up until that point been a major fan of nuclear, completely turned around. And then it was renewables. But the problem then was that the supply of renewables can be very volatile. If you have no wind, there is no wind power. If there is no rain, there is no hydropower. If there is no sun, there is no solar power. So all of these things have meant, and the fact, it seems to me, that battery storage technology has not kept up with power generation technology has meant that we still see peaks and troughs, which we can't if we, given that I guess demand tends to be relatively stable. I think it's something again that we have to think more about as in particularly because we've got increased power demands from AI and data centers, which is huge. We've also potentially got the rise in demand from more people switching from petrol-powered cars to electric vehicles. So, in the future, there is it seems to me that there's only going to be rising demand. And therefore, we're just trying to get as much electricity generation from all sources as is possible, which includes dirtier sources, either keeping them going longer, or just repairing and extending the lives generally of these places. And so anyway, so I think that having said that, I think that the push for renewables and clean energy is going to continue, but I think that it can't continue. It needs to continue as part of a broader based electricity generation package, because of the fact that we all require more electricity in the future. So what do you think, Ralph?
Yeah. Oh dear. I think I need to
more champagne.
drink some water, more champagne. That's absolutely, of course, that's absolutely true. I mean, the drive towards renewable energies is, of course, inextricably linked with climate change as well. And so it's not just that. It's not just the fact that the demand for power is going to increase manifold in the next few years, driven presumably by AI, but also by technologies which are currently not quite there, which are going to link up with AI, like quantum computing and synthetic biology and things like that. So the demand for power is clearly going to rise, and I haven't actually seen projections of this, but I would certainly see this rise by multiples, 2-3 times in the next 5-10 years, not just by percentage points. So that's one thing, and of course it is all linked up with climate change. Climate change mandates absolutely that we switch to renewable energies in our attempt to service this demand. And what are these renewable energies? As you say, they are manifold, but let us also not forget that solar energy, wind energy, etc., they don't come with zero CO2 blueprint either, because the wind farms have to be built, concrete has to be produced, which is a major use of source of CO2 pollution, etc. So we get back to the situation or the insight which I think, have derived several times before on this show, that we are in a sort of transition phase. Yes, renewable energies are going to be increasingly important, and they will form an increasing share of the energy mix. But given the rise in demand from nascent and transformational technologies such as AI, they are not going to be sufficient to service that demand, to meet that demand. So in comes nuclear power, again, as a bridge towards a time where we are hopefully going to be able to exploit nuclear fusion in a commercially viable way.
Mm.
The problem with that is that even though they are important breakthroughs and inroads made into the fusion technology development recently, we are still not there. And I still don't know how many years we are away from it. Could be 10, that would be super optimistic, might be 20. And in a space of 2 decades, we have to solve this issue. I believe that pragmatically, within these 20 years, which I have now invented as the transition period, in these 20 years, nuclear power is going to become a more important share of the energy mix, because it is CO2 neutral. We've discussed the dangers before. I believe the dangers are more in the mind of people than reality, even though we need to take into account the 3 headline-grabbing accidents which we've seen since the start of commercial exploitation of this energy form. And that is going to happen. Now, who is the driver going to be? Politicians, of course. We need politicians and governments to implement and institute policies which are going to aid further development in the technologies of green and renewable energies, as of nuclear power. But going back to the populism theme and to our chat about the European elections, the parties whose worldview is focused most on the implementation of ecology-friendly policies are the Green parties. And the Green parties in Europe everywhere have been very significantly weakened in the European elections. I think the Green parties there have lost 20 seats, which is something like 10% of their seats.
Mm.
And so you can see that in the mind of the electorate, it seems to me that either other dynamics are now seen to be preeminent, such as geopolitical risk and immigration, and or the way in which the Green parties are seeking to implement their worldview is, in the eyes of the electorate, perceived to be tinged too highly with a leftist socialist political worldview. I think that is what we've seen in the European elections, and if that is an indicator of things to come, then I would guess that all our governments in European societies are going to be at least center-right in future. And unfortunately, I think we all know that perhaps a worldview which focuses indeed champions, a rollout of ecology-friendly technology does not sort of, naturally reside
Mm.
in these parties.
Mm.
So I see I see the need. I'm a little bit wondering about whether we are going to have the political drive continuing even at the arguably, some might certainly argue, uh, insipid pace as we've seen in the past.
Mind you, it's got to change somehow quickly, isn't it? I mean that's probably why
Yes.
maybe the added impetus of things like SMRs, because um,
Yes.
the fact of the matter is that we do need more electricity. AI data centers to power the AI, all that kind of stuff. I mean, the fact that we saw recently, that you had British Volt, which was going to be in Northumberland, and have this massive gigafactory. It was supposed to be the best place for a battery gigafactory. Then it all went south, and the site eventually got sold recently to a American private equity firm who said they're going to be using it for data center to power AI. I mean, it just goes to show, the difference in terms of priorities and things like that. But anyway, I do think that we it's not a case of maybe we need. It is a case of we will need, and therefore they're going to have to do it. Whether or not that's from renewables, whether that's maybe from nuclear, I would suggest maybe it's going to come more from nuclear than it is from renewables.
Yes.
But that also depends on how quickly battery storage technology advances as well.
Yes, but I concur. It's going to be nuclear, because by the same analysis which I've just offered in terms of the future worldview hue of the political parties that we can expect to be in power, the sort of more conservative right of center parties are probably going to champion nuclear with a lot more philosophical ease, let us say, than those car parties which are left of center.
Absolutely.
So yeah,
and fossil fuels as well. But I mean, yeah, I think that they'll try.
Yeah, that's a problem.
Yeah, they'll try it, because I mean, it was like, wasn't it? Trump. There was that article recently that said that Trump had allegedly got some oil executives together and says, if you give me $1 billion, I'll make sure that the EV stuff goes away. I mean, $1 billion for my campaign. I mean, really. I mean, who knows? Right. So let's move on to the next topic. So at the beginning of the year, I said AI will become more targeted. So if last year was the voyage of discovery, or the voyage of mass discovery of AI, we saw the huge kind of rise in terms of share prices and valuations for companies who just casually mentioned AI in their statements and things, and then we saw a rise of like ETFs and things like that. Or I don't know if it was last year, but certainly this year, everyone's getting very excited. But now that has calmed down. We've seen investors saying, "Well, look, okay, it's all very well to say you're making LLMs and things, but where are you going to make money from?" And suddenly the money has really narrowed in terms of where it's being targeted. And certainly investors, I mean, I said in last week's Watson's Daily about how, a lot of these ETFs have done really badly because they contained companies who weren't, who promised a lot but haven't actually delivered, particularly on the bottom line. I mean, this is why NVIDIA has done so well, because not only are there high expectations, it continues to exceed those expectations whilst the hype still continues. And that's why they have become the most valuable company in the world. So anyway, I think it's right to say that AI is going to become more targeted. There's going to be more focus on profitability. We've already seen, I've forgotten the guy's name, but he was originally from DeepMind, and he was poached by Microsoft to head up their consumer division. And
Mustafa
Yes.
Suleyman.
That's the one. Yes. So that's very interesting. So clearly they're trying to boost things in that regard. But anyway, yes. What do you think of this, Ralph?
No, no doubt, absolutely. It's an interesting topic, of course. I mean, AI, I feel, is being discussed in the public mind with. I'm going to paraphrase it like this. Everybody knows that AI is going to change the world, the universe, everything, every fiber of our being, most fundamentally, in a way that humanity has never seen before.
Hmm.
But when? When is it actually going to do this? I'm going to play with my mobile now, and I can't see any AI application on it. You see, this is the sort of thing. We are primed to expect a most momentous upheaval of our life brought on by AI, but we're not really seeing it yet. And it's almost like it's sort of the hype cycle may shorten in this particular case. By which I mean this: we've seen LLMs. They were revolutionary. Now they're in the hands of everybody. But as far as I can see, we're not really using this for very much more than creating astounding images and maybe some country songs, which are astonishing to listen to. But what do I actually do with that? I can listen to a country song from a human being. Now I can listen to an AI's country song. In itself, that's not a killer application. For something to be investable and to be the next revolution, such as the motor car or automotive industry used to be in the 19th and 20th centuries, or such like the computer, the personal computer used to be, we need AI to become a commodity which is in everybody's household and which offers usable services, such like a household robot or a working personal assistant which is on my mobile, which actually works, by which I mean which I can actually ask things that useful things. Like, for example, I'll just give you an anecdote. I mean, we were in Italy last year, and we were in Naples, and Naples is the town of pizza. And so I basically thought, well, we have to have pizza in this place. I mean, it's obvious. So where are we going to go? So I asked ChatGPT to make a list of the 5 most highly rated pizza places within a 2-mile radius of where I was and pin the locations to a map. And the response was that I can't pin anything to a map because I can't actually access the internet. Now, I wasn't very highly impressed with this. It gave me a list, which was fine, but I had to basically see for myself where these pizzerias were. So I'm not saying this isn't working yet. It is certainly working, but it isn't working well enough to be a usable consumer product. And I think that is where we need to be. We need to have robots in everybody's household. We need to have industrial scale applications which are the direct consequence of AI-enabled research, new medication, pharmaceutical products, which use our newly found ability, which we got from mapping out the genome, but more recently from mapping out the entire human proteinome or whatever it's called. It's the makeup of the proteins of the human body, which has been actually mapped incidentally by DeepMind, because you just mentioned the co-founder. And I think that's where we need to go. So far, the most potent, investable success stories have actually been industries that are a second order effect to AI. NVIDIA, you mentioned NVIDIA, is a chip maker for basically, well, chip maker in general, but they're making chips especially also for AI applications. And because everybody expects AI to be the next huge thing, that is why NVIDIA benefited from this massively. So I think we are possibly nearing the cusp where this is tipping over. I'm myself still a little bit skeptical. I think we're still years away from it, but I say that with a bit of a halting voice because I can't really emotionally, or that's not the right word, I can't intuitively gauge how long this will take or how long developments in the AI industry are taking, because growth very clearly is exponential. And so human beings always think in terms of linear growth. I certainly am. And so when I say we're seeing the cusp, it may be years away, maybe it's not years, maybe it's just a year or a few months. But the tipping point is close, and I think we are very soon going to see a substantial rollout of AI-empowered consumer commodities or consumer products.
Okay, fair enough. All good. Right, we better crack on with the next one, which is quite a big topic, really, but I think we need to sort of wrap it up relatively quickly. But I was talking about more companies. So I suggested so more companies will enter or consolidate their businesses in the Middle East and India. I mean, we've already seen quite a lot of companies moving to the Middle East, and looking at possibilities in India and things. And it just seems to me that there will be. I think that there is going to continue to be more of this, and some of it is to do with the Middle East opening up to say to other countries in order to help their growth prospects, give them maybe skills and things that they don't already have, and they power that with the Middle Eastern countries power that with oil revenues. I think that it would also be fair to say that maybe over the last few years we've not seen as much M&A and IPO activity going on, and I think that in many ways the only kind of growth in town has been in the Middle East, and so as a result of that, there's been a lot of shifting of resources over there, and I think this has been particularly interesting. I think there's always been a lot of interest in India, and I think a lot of people will say that India does have a lot of potential, given the youth of its youthful nature of its population, the skills that it has, and the prices at which it can provide expertise. But what do you think, Ralph?
Well, yeah, we discussed this before, and again, before we came on air, if that's the expression which you use for streams today, and I wonder, I don't disagree with anything you said. The Middle East is certainly an arena of potent growth, and it does certainly attract a lot of investments currently. Where I pause and just question, asking a question, I don't know the answer myself, is this: is any growth which you are likely to find in the economies of the Middle East necessarily going to be sustained and sustainable? Because if you look at these countries, then you will of course find that most of their wealth is directly derived from the oil industry. If they didn't have oil, I would venture to say they didn't have wealth. And I'm not making a rather trite argument. I'm not saying that, and therefore, renewable energies are going to take over. Oil is a finite resource. It's not going to be finite enough. I mean, it's not going to run out in the next 50 years or so. And so I wonder whether the Middle Eastern societies have been successful in diversifying themselves enough for a diversified, scintillating economy to take hold and thrive? That's a question. I mean, this is up to discuss. I'm, of course, not sitting on the fence. I'm more skeptical than hopeful in terms of the Middle East, and I'm more hopeful than skeptical in terms of India. Because, as you said, it's a young population. It is a sizable population at 1.3 billion. I believe it is larger than China, just about. And it is a very skilled population. And I'm going to tell you guys the anecdote just for fun. I sometimes take sort of entry tests myself in mathematics and engineering and things. And so I recently did the Cambridge entry test for mathematics, and it was hard. It was really hard, but I could do some of it. And then I took the JEE exam, which is the Indian entry exam for if you wish to study engineering at universities. I couldn't do anything. It was absolutely appalling. I've never even seen those questions. I think I could do one. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not casting myself as an expert or as any reasonable expertise in these subjects, but from my own sort of anecdotal experience, I can say that the quality of education in the what we call the STEM subjects in India is sky high. And so going back to my question about the Middle East, I do wonder whether we can reduce the success of societies in some way to the ingenuity, the intellectual quality, the level of education of its population. Because that, I think, is why Germany did well after the Second World War. Most of its wealth is based on the inventions of German engineers at the turn of the last century, which is the automotive industry. You can say probably the same for all of the societies in the free world. You can also say that for China, for example, and I think you can definitely say that for India. I do wonder to which extent you can say the same for the Middle Eastern societies, because they are much less transparent and socially mobile, if you like, because they are not democracies in the main, and they do not treat human rights with the same level of quality perhaps as the free world, and as a consequence I see less intellectual diversity in these societies. There's a trite metric which people tend to bring up in this context, which is that the number of Nobel Prize winners coming from Middle Eastern countries is very low, whereas those coming from other countries is very high. I'm not sure that I really want to use that metric. It is probably not going to mean very much, but it possibly means a little bit. And so that's what I'm sort of surmising. But like I said, I'm sort of squirming around a little bit here because it is more questions in my mind that I'm sharing with you guys here than hard and fast insights. I would not want to sell this as an insight. It is just a skepticism which I have, and from where I'm sitting, which is here in my study in London, I would probably favor an investment in India over an investment in the Middle Eastern societies.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, it's a very interesting one, and obviously something that is just going to develop over time. And the thing is, I suppose, especially in the Middle East, there's so much money. They can almost, it feels to me like there's almost an attitude of build it and it will come. Throw enough money at something, and they've got enough money to do it, and they've got they've got the relations, they've got the international wherewithal. They can do it. So obviously we'll just have to see what happens. But anyway, thank you very much indeed, Ralph, for your time and your insight. As always, really do appreciate it. I think we'll have to leave it there. obviously, I just thought it would be a nice idea to just have a quick look back at what we were talking about in January and see where we are. But thank you very much indeed, Ralph, for your time.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Thanks, guys, for having me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye.